Hello, everybody. Welcome to your Tuesday afternoon or Tuesday evening with QENDO. And we have some international people here. So welcome to you all. I'm not sure what time it is over there, but thanks for taking some time to join us today. I'll give everyone a few more moments to come online. It's just hit 7 o'clock. And I can see a few other people are joining in. So tonight we are really excited to introduce a lot of you to a number of researchers who are at the Institute for Molecular Bioscience. So QENDO is a partner with the Institute for Molecular Bioscience, and some of the work and research that they do there is around endometriosis. And they have some pretty amazing researchers there. Researchers who have been working in the area of endo for decades, and they're really paving that way forward for endo research. So I'd really love you to join me in welcoming Kamara from IMB, who's the Director of Innovation there, Professor Grant Montgomery, who is QENDO's patron and also has almost dedicated his most of his career to researching in endometriosis, which is huge. And he was involved in endo before it was cool. And then we have Sally, who's also a part of the research team at IMB working with Grant. So welcome to you all, and welcome to everyone watching here tonight. It's a really great way to share about research that's happening and really to promote that there is research going on, and it often gets hidden behind that screen. So it's great to talk with you all today. If you have any questions throughout the discussion tonight, please put them in the Q&A chat box. If we are unable to get to them, we will share them around with the researchers and share answers with in a post email for after the session tonight. So don't be shy. If we're unable to answer them, we'll get back to you in another way. So to kick tonight off, I'd love to introduce you to Kamara, who is an absolute incredible woman who works in the Institute for Molecular Bioscience, and really fortunate to work with Kamara on a lot of projects. And she really does bring people together to promote and influence so many areas across different sectors. And we're lucky enough to have her doing some of this in the world of endo. So Kamara is going to talk to you and introduce to you a little bit about IMB, who they are, what they are, where do they fit in, and give you a bit of background info. Over to you, Kamara.
Thank you, Jess. I must say, with a wonderful introduction like that, I'm absolutely incredibly humbled. And of course, ditto, tenfold. I think it's undeniable the impact that you're having in this space, and what an incredible champion you are for the needs of women and their loved ones and the families around them in this space. And I think born out of that has been the partnership with QENDO, which from the Institute's vantage, we're delighted to have in place. And it's a powerful one and an important to us, because it helps us to do, just as you've alluded to demystify research in a way. And so for those of you who aren't aware of IMB, we're actually 21 years young. So in the context of the Australian landscape, we should be handing around our key and getting it signed for our 21st birthday this year. We were the first institute established by the University of Queensland, and it was a wonderful genesis of what the Queensland government were hoping to achieve through the Smart State agenda in the late 90s, together with the first Chuck Feeney gift, or the Atlantic Philanthropic Gift, that was injected into the state of Queensland. So the vision for the Institute in those days was to really reset the agenda for biodiversity and life sciences investigation here in Queensland, and offer an alternative financial stimulus or a stream of income and revenue for the state beyond some of the other pillars, such as mining and construction, that you're probably more familiar with. And we have certainly delivered in that time. We've had something like 16 spin outs in 20 short years. 3 of those are still in market today. More recently, we had an acquisition of one of our companies, the largest of its kind in the Australian research landscape and also in Europe. I think altogether it's about $1 billion once all the milestones are met through that Roche acquisition, which is absolutely incredible. And so the genesis came from the efforts of Professor John Maddock and Professor Peter Andrews, who in more recent times has gone on to be the state's chief scientist. But we were born out of a vision to use genetics to make an impact. And Grant and his team and the incredible breadth of researchers around him today certainly carry that baton high and very capably. So we're delighted that we've got Grant within our landscape to use his unique insights and capitalize on the microbiology and the chemistry capabilities of the Institute to be able to deliver dynamic results through for the broader community. There's nothing that we're not pursuing at the Institute that's not done with the vision to actually deliver tangible translated benefits back to the community at large. And through partnerships like this, we're able to showcase what it is that Grant and Sally and their team are hoping to achieve. It is a long game. The efforts to End Endo, which they'll no doubt detail to you in full shortly, but their vision is to essentially make this not an issue into the future for women, mothers, sisters, daughters everywhere. And so it's an absolute pleasure to support their work and let you know what the Institute's trying to achieve, and thank Jess and her incredible team at QENDO for their ongoing partnership. I think this is the third year we've done something around the month of March in the effort to combine our efforts to shine a spotlight on this very, very significant issue. And we're delighted to continue that partnership and have the chance to connect with everyone this evening. So thank you, Jess, and over to the more important minds on the panel this evening.
Thank you, Kumara. Absolutely. And what I really love about IMB is just the serious passion. And when you go there and talk to the researchers and the team, everyone's just energized to do good. And that is so wonderful. And you can really feel that whenever you are talking to one of the researchers or talking to the team or being involved in any events, and you just want to get behind it because you can see that they have poured their life into this, just like so many people in the endo community are living with these conditions, or they've poured their life into it too. So it's really great to connect with people who are really in it for the right reasons and have got their heart in such amazing places. So let's jump straight in. Grant Montgomery, Professor Montgomery, tell us who you are.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks for the introduction and welcome everybody to this. And we're looking forward to answering your questions. But I thought I would give us a little bit of background, everybody a little bit of background about, where we started at this program and why we're doing it. So I guess I have a background in genetics and genomics and reproductive diseases. And about 25 years ago, we started a program on genetic studies in endometriosis with Susan Trelaw, who was the previous patron of QENDO and the patron of QENDO at the time. And the reason is that we know from some of our studies that about half the risk is due to genetic factors and the other half is due to environmental factors. And at the time, and actually still, we'd love to know what the environmental factors are, but it's quite difficult to really be able to drill down on those. And so genetics gives us a bit of a window into it, although it takes a long time. So anyway, we started these genetic studies and are continuing these with the International Endometriosis Genetics Consortium. And so this has been going on now, as I say, for 20 years, but the pace has really accelerated in the last 10 years. And so the big study that we're just about finishing up with the Genetics Consortium is a study with about 15 other groups around the world, and 60,000 women with endometriosis have participated in these studies. And that's identified over 40 independent genetic risk factors. So, the I guess the trajectory of the genetics in endometriosis and other complex diseases is that we will continue to try to get bigger studies to really understand the genetic risk factors better. But because we've made a lot of progress, then in the last 10 years, my group has expanded our kind of horizons to begin now to do research to understand how these genetic risk factors might change gene regulation and help to cause endometriosis. And so we're studying using the latest genomic studies with advanced cell biology and advances from around the world, really sort of harnessing all of that to understand the functional consequences of these genetic risk factors. And that's to help us really understand the biology, which I think we need to do. So then the other part of the work that we've started now that there's lots of genetic data is to try to use all of that genetic data to understand the links between endometriosis and other things like symptoms and diseases that have been associated with it. And so that's something that Sally and some of our students are working on quite hard, and that's quite interesting. We're well connected across the world. So as I say, we're part of the Endometriosis Genetics Consortium, but also we work with Professor Linda Giudice at the University of California in San Francisco, looking at genetic and environmental effects on, I guess, DNA regulation in endometrium. And that's funded by the National Institutes of Health in the US. We have a project with Caroline Gargett and her team at Monash that's funded by the US Department of Defense, analyzing the role of stem cells in endometrium. So that's quite an interesting project. We work with Geeta Mishra, who's at the UQ School of Population Studies, and she's the director of the Australian Longitudinal Study on Women's Health. And so that's a big study that's being run there. And Sally has a grant with her from the Medical Research Futures Fund to look at some of the consequences of endometriosis within that study. And more recently, we've started a program with Akwasi Amoko at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Health and Women's Hospital, recruiting patients for our ongoing studies. So it's quite a big program. And then, you know, I mean, one way to describe the IMB, I guess, is discovery to drugs or treatments. And, you know, initially our studies were more at the discovery end, but slowly we're getting along that road to help us understand. So just some of the outcomes, I guess, is that one of the things that's clear is the genetic studies have reshaped global views of endometriosis, particularly within the clinical community. And I think that's a really important starting point. We think that there's probably more than one mechanism involved in endometriosis, although many of the researchers believe that changes in cells in the endometrium is probably one cause, with the cells getting into the peritoneal cavity and perhaps helping to cause lesions. So now functional studies tend to support this view. And they're beginning to show that together with estrogen regulations, probably affecting things like cell proliferation and cell survival. We need a lot more evidence for this, but this is kind of challenging research, which is why it takes a long time. But the big global efforts are really helping that. So we don't do this on our own, although we're focused on endometriosis. There's lots going on in this kind of overall space of genetics and genomics around the world. So we're also involved in a lot of cell biology, trying to answer some of the critical questions. And one of which I think is, you know, is endometriosis one disease, or are there subtypes as there are for other sort of common diseases? And that's going to really be a focus for much of our work in this sort of immediate future. And we believe that these long-term studies are important to help understand the disease and develop better ways of diagnosis and treatment. And it won't happen tomorrow, but we're hoping that, you know, we can really make a difference with all our colleagues around the world.
Grant, you spoke a lot about there around genetics and environment. Can you just talk through the difference and what does that mean for those that don't know?
Well, of course, they're interrelated, but but I guess it's a distinction that we kind of make as researchers, trying to break down the problem so that we can address it. So by genetics, we mean we don't mean mutations in genes, the sorts of mutations that would lead to cystic fibrosis. These are small changes that just are part of the variation that makes us all individuals. So each of these risk factors has pretty small effects on their own, but together they add up to make up that sort of 50% of genetic risk. But none of them are diagnostic in any way for individuals. And so that's the kind of genetic component, is the bit of that, the part that we inherit. The environmental is a very broad term, and it can mean lots of things. It can mean things that happened during development. It can mean things, perhaps the environment to which people are exposed over time and at certain times. It could be things like, I don't know, chemicals in the environment and those sorts of things. It also includes things like cellular changes that just happen over time. In other words, changes to the DNA that we didn't inherit but have happened in our cells as we grow and age and things like that. So it's all of those things. And the real problem for studying it is you don't always know when they could have occurred, right? So whether the environmental things that we're exposed to had an effect sort of early on in life, or they've been cumulative. I mean, it's very difficult, I think, to tease that out, which is.
When someone goes through a traumatic event, so in their life, does that change the environment and the cells in their bodies? What are your thoughts around that?
I think it depends what you mean by traumatic events. I mean, some things obviously will, but generally that would have to be something that caused some downstream cellular effects, I think. I guess we just don't know enough to be able to, to be really clear about that. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no doubt that, that traumatic events during our life have a big influence on things later on, but whether they specifically affect endometriosis risk as such, we just don't know.
Fantastic, thank you. There's a lot of these questions that come up in the community and online and even in conversation that there's so much work to do in this space, but really interesting to hear your thoughts. Sally, I'm going to throw over the mic to you. Can you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, what interested you, where have you come from? Let's get to know Sally.
Yes. So hello, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join tonight. So I joined Grant's group a little over 4 years ago. So my background is in actually veterinary science. So I did a degree in animal and veterinary science down at the University of Sydney. And then on completing that, I did a PhD in cancer genetics in dogs. So initially my research was looking at genetic risk factors for cancer, but in particular dog breeds. And so once I finished my PhD and I was looking where to go next with my career, I came across the opportunity in Grant's lab to work with endometriosis and other kind of reproductive disorders. So it was a great opportunity for me to just translate my skills in genetic risk factors from animals to humans, because I guess it's same basic principles, just a little bit of different genetics in the background there. And it was also a really good opportunity because understanding the impact that endo has on the community, and I've had endometriosis in my family as well, so I've got relatives that also have the disease. And so it was also a good opportunity to me to work on something that I'm also passionate about. And so my role in Grant's group is I'm the statistical geneticist. So I analyze a lot of our big data sets. So I'm not as cool as getting to wear the white coat in the lab necessarily, but I'm the one sitting behind the computer most of my days, analyzing all the data that we've got coming in. And I also get to work with a lot of those international groups that Grant was talking about. So I'm involved in a lot of their analyses that go on those really big data sets. And I have a role in those analyses. And also, as well as following up a lot of the things that Grant said. So a lot of my work is around kind of following up what those genetic risk factors are doing. So following up the mechanisms, what they're doing to the actual biology, as well as looking at the overlap with a lot of other diseases and conditions and trying to use that information to help us understand mechanisms involved in endometriosis as well. So I'm what would be classified as an early career researcher in the field, I guess. So I'm relatively new compared to Grant's vast knowledge in the area, but it's been a great opportunity for me, and I hope to be able to also continue on this research moving forward, to make sure that we keep looking for more of these answers with the work that we're doing.
Sally, you really are the next generation of research for endometriosis, so it's so important that we can continue the work, continue the funding, continue the awareness around what is actually happening here. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but this is one of the only groups that are really looking at what is actually causing this, what is at a cellular level, how is this happening, what is going on, and we need to keep that. We need to keep that going because it's such a huge knowledge source, and it would be so disappointing to throw it away. Sally, you spoke about data sets and sitting behind a computer. So what are data sets? Why are they important? And what are you looking for?
Yes, so a few examples of some of the data sets and what I mean by that. So I guess a lot of our work involves people's genetics, so their DNA essentially. So a lot of my work will look at a lot of the variations in people's DNA. So we've got large cohorts, both international and national, where we've been able to look at the variation across DNA in a large number of women. So it's my job to kind of sift through those millions of points of variation on the computer to try and find associations between those variations and risk of endometriosis. And I guess once we've found those, my next role is we also have data sets that are looking at the expression of genes in the endometrium. So we'll have gene expression levels from samples from hundreds of women from the endometrium. And so then my role is to then see if any of those genetic variants are also linked to changes in expression in the cells in the endometrium. We also have like more clinical data sets as well, so extra information in terms of the types of lesions, the surgical locations of lesions, a little bit of symptomology as well, so trying to link what we're seeing in gene expression and also variation back to what's seen in the clinics and what women are experiencing. So it's almost multiple levels of different kinds of data that it's my role to try and kind of integrate them to get a bigger picture of what's actually going on. How are these variants affecting the genes, and how are those genes then involved in pathways that might be of some significance to the disease?
Wow. Did you at the end of the day? Oh my gosh. So we have a question from Maggie, and I think you've touched on a few of it there, but just to directly answer the question, can you share some of the key findings from the recent research recent sets that you've worked through? Any key findings? Maggie is a science student and also lives with Endo. So from a science point of view, keen to know what's happening in your work in that sphere.
Yes, so I guess some of the most significant ones that were either recently published or should hopefully soon to be published. So we've got some of the biggest data sets looking at gene expression in the endometrium itself. So we've been able to really look at how genes in the endometrium, how they behave across the menstrual cycle, and also if any of the variation that we've seen that's associated with endometriosis, we've found some links between that variation and the behavior of those genes, of certain genes in endometrium, which could potentially mean they're of interest for further research. So understanding that link between the genetic risk and potentially the involvement of genes. We've also, as Grant touched on, we're involved in the International Endometriosis Genetics Consortium. So one of the big findings out of that is we've been able to identify a number of new regions or new genomic risks from that. So initially, from our latest study, we had 14, and so that's jumped up to over 40 genetic risk regions now.
Yep. So what's a genetic? So tell me a little bit more about that. Can we break that down for people that really don't understand what it is? What does that mean?
Yes. So I guess by a genetic risk region, so I guess it's a location on your DNA, I guess, essentially. So it's a source of variation. So we're all these sources of variation that would make us different. And so there are certain bits of our DNA that are different, that are seen more often in women with endometriosis than women without endometriosis. So it's just finding those, what are common variants, but they're seen more often in women with endo than without. And so therefore that kind of directs us to those spots in the DNA to try and find out what that variation is doing in terms of a functional effect on either a gene or a biological pathway. So it's literally a section or a location in your DNA that's has a variant that's seen to increase the risk of endo. I probably didn't explain it well.
I think I got that. If anyone else would like a further explanation or to review that.
So maybe I'll come up a level, and just say that research progresses on multiple fronts, and so there are drug companies and clinical researchers who are looking at ways, I guess, of or trying to find treatments that can be used now. And it's probably fair to say that for endometriosis, most of the treatments are treating symptoms because we don't know what the causes are. And so, our research is more at the discovery end. And so we're interested in trying to drill down and find out what we believe are the mechanisms that might cause endometriosis, and what are the pathways, genetic pathways or changes in gene regulation that actually combine with other environmental factors to cause endometriosis. So ours is trying to define those pathways, and the way that the genetic studies work is start to find the variation, which is what Sally was talking about, and then how that changes and the expression of genes. So what genes are involved and what pathways. And so if you ask what we found over the last few years is we're beginning to understand what we think that those pathways might be, and so another big question is, well, what tissue or what cells are important? And so the genetic studies and the follow-up functional studies that Sally's talking about are helping us to understand. So we would say that the data is clearly pointing to some changes in the endometrium, which are likely to be underlying a lot of disease risk, possibly not all of it, but a lot of it. And we're trying to dissect the individual cells and then understand what genes and pathways, because that then gives us the gene targets that we can think about as targets for completely novel treatments, something that's kind of treating underlying causes. So I think the outcomes then, specifically are, I think we're, is knowing that the endometrium changes, small changes in the endometrium probably are important, supporting some of the very early ideas about the disease. And we have some target genes and pathways that we're trying to follow up now to because again, the way research works is you have initial finding, but you have to replicate it and look at it in different ways to prove that actually the ideas are really correct before you can start looking at drug targets and things like that. So if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that does. Great. So what is next for you both? Where is your research heading? What are you hoping to achieve? Do you have any big goals other than aiming to end endo? What is the next step? What are the next 1 to 3 years look like?
So I think the big goals are to try to develop an integrated diagnostic and treatment pathway using all of the new technology. And it won't just be us. But I mean, clearly one of the things that is changing is the use of diagnostic imaging. And so, that is going to be important. But if as that becomes more widespread, what are some of the other issues around that? And that includes, better diagnostics, which might include what we would call developing sort of risk scores to understand whether we can put together a lot of information on symptoms and genetic risk factors that might help us to at least identify individuals that are more at risk than others. So it won't be diagnostic at this stage. But I think if we, and then, looking at that as to what the appropriate treatments are. And in the field generally, I mean, people are talking about more personalized treatments. In other words, treatments that are appropriate for individual women. And this is for endometriosis, but also other things, because in the past, a lot of the treatments and a lot of the drugs, for example, are designed to be useful for most people. But what we know is that, individuals vary in their responses. So can we predict that and can we do that? And that's why I said right at the start that one of the things that we're really working hard on is trying to understand whether it is one disease with variable presentations or whether the variable presentations are due to different subtypes. Because what we've learned from all the cancer research, for example, is that if there are indeed disease subtypes, then if you can diagnose those different subtypes, then you apply different treatments for women that have different subtypes of breast cancer, for example. So that's a big aim, but fit that into the overall paradigm of integrated diagnosis and treatment.
Fantastic. We've got quite a number of questions that I'll run through. So you spoke about some treatments. Are you looking at anything for the actual lesions?
I mean, we are thinking about that. I mean, we don't have anything at the moment that we can pull out of the hat but that work has been very difficult because, of course, the amount of endometrial tissue in those lesions can be quite small, and so that has been. I mean, one of the difficulties in the field has been not having really good models for trying to understand how lesions form and how they progress and how you might treat them. So I think one of the things that's really changing in the field is the advanced cell biology that people are beginning to bring to these sorts of problems. And it's particularly relevant for endometriosis because, as I say, we don't have good models. It's, you know, and unlike some other things that might have had animal models that could help with this, that isn't the case. And so Brett McKinnon in our lab is using some of these advanced cell biology models to model both the different cell types in endometrium, but also growing them together, which I think, and he's not the only one. There are other groups around the world that are really working hard on this. There was a really good talk at the World Congress, World Endometriosis Congress, on, you know, developing these kind of cell-based models in the lab that can really help. So I think we and others will really use these models, and I think once we can develop them and run them at scale, then that will be useful to discover things that might help with treating the lesions and or you know, testing out drug treatments in you know, better models that I think will really speed things up.
We know that some people can develop new lesions, so they'll have surgery, they'll have them removed by someone who knows what they're doing, and then new lesions are developed. Do you, in your mind, do you see this as a different lesion or different type? So not a reoccurrence of the same lesion, but a new lesion forming if we're going on the path of different types of disease?
So Brett worked in Switzerland at the hospital in Bern for about 8 years before he came back to Australia, and he still works with that group. In fact, he was running their lab for quite a while, and it still has involved in that. And so that group in Bern, and with Brett's help, has just published a study looking at the recurrence. So that's an interesting question, and in fact they show that indeed recurrence is relatively common, and that for the most part the women where it recurs with the same, at least the same type of lesion that they had before, or sometimes the same type plus, you know, so if they had superficial lesions initially, then, you know, they might have superficial and deep infiltrating sort of subsequently. So then, I mean, that leaves one question which we don't know, and this is not about how good the surgeons are, but we don't know whether, if mostly the lesions that reoccur are the same type of lesion, was it, you know, is it a new lesion, you know, a completely new one that's just started, and so women tend to develop the same types of lesions, or maybe there were other sort of cells around that were not obvious to the surgeon, and it might be regrowing from those. I mean, we just don't know that. And, you know, one suspects that, you know, there may be a little bit of both in that, but, you know, because I know the good surgeons will take out, you know, a little bit of tissue around it so that they get the margins. So they probably do get most of it. So a lot of them might be just, you know, there's a tendency for women to have those lesions, which brings me back to the point about subtypes.
Yeah, fascinating. It's it's a big question, isn't it? They're really big questions.
They're big questions. They are big questions.
For answering them in the way that you have. Going back to those environmental factors, the impact of dioxins as a part of those environmental factors on endo. Do you know of any research that has been done on that particular chemical?
So there's quite a lot of well, there are people working in this area. I mean, obviously, there were initial reports about dioxin, and, you know, my understanding, and I haven't followed all the research really closely, is that the role of dioxin per se is a bit equivocal. That, you know, some of the subsequent studies haven't been as clear cut. I think there's sort of increasing evidence. I think the environmental estrogens or estrogen treatments, I think there's probably a role for it. I just don't think we know exactly which compounds and at what point along the journey they're really important. I mean, is it a cumulative? Is it something cumulative? Is it is it important? Are there particular stages when that might be important during development, for example? And because we don't get real-time measures of exposures, so again, the sort of epidemiological studies are difficult because you don't know how much individuals were exposed to or at what times. And so if you measure something now, I mean, it doesn't always tell you, what happened in the past. And so, the studies have not been definitive, but then it's in the nature of those kinds of studies that they're pretty difficult to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to fertility, and the role that endo can impact in some cases on the fertility, particularly the AMH levels. In your field, Sally and Grant, have you seen any research that has linked or shown endometriosis impacting those levels?
I think that's quite a complicated story.
Yeah.
So, and the reason that I say that is that the AMH levels are a measure of ovarian reserve. And of course, there are age-specific changes in ovarian reserve, and they're more related to the time of menopause than age, if you like, because there's quite a lot of variation in the age at menopause. So I guess the closer a woman is to the end of reproductive life, then the number of, or the follicle pool that still is left is diminishing. So, and the AMH is related to that. So, it's, and you don't know at the time that you measure it exactly, where they are, but it is a reasonable measure of that. But is there any role in endometriosis beyond what's happening, in terms of follicle reserve? I think is a bit of an open question. So I guess that's a long answer, but the short answer is, well, no, we don't know that specifically is involved. That is, in other words, is it cause or consequence? I think most of what we've seen is consequence at the moment of the changes in ovarian reserve. But there's, again, I mentioned right at the start, the wealth of genetic data that's available. So there are ways of actually addressing those kinds of questions, which is too complicated to really, to go through in detail. But, people are using all the genetic data to try to answer those questions about cause and effect. And I think as the wealth of genetic data gets better, then, we'll have really better estimates and we can kind of address those things. It just hasn't been done yet.
Yeah, there's so many questions around your data sets. What type of, do you have an idea of the age of the people who have gifted their DNA? Let's call it gifting their DNA.
Yeah.
What age groups are you looking at?
So people have been extremely generous over the years. The initial study that we started with Sutra Law, I think we recruited about 3,500 women with endometriosis, all who very generously allowed Sue to get hold of clinical records to be able to get a clinical diagnosis of endometriosis. And that's still probably one of the biggest studies in the world for that. And we still use that data in the genetics consortium studies. And so, with that and with other studies, we recruit women, I guess, across the age span. And particularly in the in Sue's study, we were recruiting mothers and daughters. So we have a big age range across that.
Fantastic. That's great. Moving to a condition that comes up a lot with endo, and I'm leading in here into adenomyosis. Do you know of any research being conducted on adenomyosis? Is that something that you're looking at, or know of anyone that is?
It's not something that Sally and I and my group have looked at specifically, but some of the groups that we work with are looking at it. Again, one of the difficulties has been it's actually relatively difficult to diagnose, I think, and the but the diagnostic imaging is really helping with that. To date, there aren't lots of really big studies with it that have the diagnostic imaging, but I think that those are coming, and the diagnostic image is really going to help, and so there are lots of questions, obviously, around the relationship between endometriosis and adenomyosis, and just what we would expect to observe. So it's something that now, in the groups that we're working with that are beginning to do diagnostic imaging, then we expect to do a bit more than we have. We just have focused on endometriosis because it's been relatively easier to diagnose.
Yeah, absolutely. Sally, you're a female researcher. You identify as a female, and so we know that research can be a really tough area, and often quite a gamble in career choices, particularly for women, and the layers upon layers of extra things that we need to think about as a female. And I won't get into that conversation here, but where I'm heading to is, Sally, what inspires you to stay dedicated in light of all of this, and what keeps you going on those difficult days?
Yes, so I think so as being relatively early in my career in research, I guess, to date, I've been very lucky in terms of the opportunities that I've had in my career, having Grant as a mentor and having the opportunities I have to really start to form my own kind of independence as a researcher, which can be quite difficult. And I guess especially as a woman as well, there are a few extra challenges, but in the field itself, it's also can be a bit challenging being an early career researcher in general, competing with a lot of the other researchers out there that are working in much more, I guess, well-known or much more well-funded areas. So it can be quite competitive. But in saying that, like, working with a disease that has the impact that it does certainly pushes me along and gives me the incentive to keep going. And I have been given some really good opportunities to progress my career in this field. And I feel like already through my involvement in a lot of the international work, I've been able to kind of give myself a more of a leading role in the field, which I feel very lucky to have been able to do. And I guess just having the support as well of all the other amazing researchers at IMB, and having that mentorship around to guide my career. And yeah, so it's a lot of different avenues that keep me going, but it's definitely it's an important field, and it's something that I'm passionate about. And I love the looking into the genetics behind diseases, and it's a passion of mine. So having the opportunity to base my career in that is incentive to keep going, as difficult as it can and competitive as it can sometimes be. It's definitely worth the effort, and it's worth pushing for the outcomes.
You really are working, you really all are working at such a grassroots, fundamental level when it comes to endometriosis. You are doing such incredible work in that space. There are so much amazing research going on, but like we've said, there's no one really looking at, except for people like you, looking at zero at point zero. Where do we even begin, or how do we do all these other amazing treatments if we don't actually know the disease? And that's where you guys come in. I've just got goosebumps. That's amazing work.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. And I mean, that's always been my, way of thinking about it. I mean, of course there are treatments, and of course there are people working on new things. But I actually believe that until we really understand the mechanisms of the disease, then we'll make incremental changes. To really help, we need to make big changes. I mean, we need to be able to get at or get back into things like prevention. We're not ever going to do that until we understand the disease. And we talked about environmental factors. I mean, I think that if we understand the mechanisms and the pathways, then we can think about designing real experiments or real studies that will help us to understand those environmental factors. And in the end, I mean, those are the things that we're going to be able to change, I guess, is the environment. Those are the short-term things that we can do. But we need the disease mechanisms before we can really understand and really think about, effective studies that will help us, address what are those things. And I'd just like to sort of go back to what Sally said. I mean, you're very generous, Sally, but I mean, you're a really important member of the team. And, it is a career choice about whether to, for example, stay in endometriosis or, work in other things like cancer, which is obviously, a big field that's advancing really quickly. And I think, the hardest thing for somebody in Sally's position is, moving from the kind of short-term funding to more, having fellowships and more secure, funding for her position. And so in things like cancer research, there's lots of foundations and so on that have funding and have, scholarships that can help get on the ground. So one of the things that I would really like to see in research like endometriosis and so on is that there's more help for, young career researchers to really establish themselves to be able to stay in the field. I mean, I've been fortunate to have had fellowships, for a number of years now that, given me sort of 5 years funding at a stretch, which is better than sort of year to year. And, it's really important in the early career. And I think, that's a real problem. I wish the government would address it, but they're not. And it's actually getting harder and harder. So I think collectively as a community, we've got to think about those kinds of things.
Endometriosis affects 1 in 10 or 1 in 9, depending on the literature. And it's just as common as asthma and diabetes.
Absolutely.
And you look at the funding for research similar to what you guys are doing compared to endo, it's just not even on the same scale. Yeah. So we really do need to have the community get behind us. And if you want to donate directly to the research in IMB, you can do that through the QENDO website. If you donate to on the donate page, there's a section for research. We're very transparent. Any money that comes through there, we directly give to this team here. So they can continue in doing this it really is grassroots fundamental work. Without it, how are we going to know and learn about what treatment, what medication, if we don't actually know what the beast that we are dealing with does or is, or where it comes from? So how can, so many people talk to their GPs or other clinicians. How can people get behind and learn more about what you both are doing? So and I've seen this in the community, this amazing community of people that live or are affected by endo. They are the ones out there educating their community. And they do that through sharing and education. How, in your minds, can they do that to back the research that you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, obviously a few years ago, the researchers and the patient groups got together with the politicians in federal parliament and generated this national action plan for endometriosis. And, you know, that was great. And I think it's a really important blueprint. And there's some really important things that have come out of that. You know, you're talking about 1 in 9. That's a study we did with Gita, you know, that showed that in fact in Australia, it probably is 1 in 9 from the data from the Australian Longitudinal Study on Women's Health. And so, you know, I think that, you know, the work that you do, Jess, and that QENDO does, I mean, it would be great to have a national endometriosis patients group or grouping. I don't really mind, but, you know, speak with one voice. If all the patients can speak with one voice, I think that allows you as the patients to get behind that, to have a, you know, it was clear from the work with the national politicians that they really, there is some momentum there, but they need to have one group that they can talk to, because I think that would help. I think it also means that one grouping or group, if they can, if the patients are happy to make donations that will support the work, then that one group can kind of drive that. And I think they could drive the outcomes of the National Action Plan. They can lobby for better funding. I mean, you might have noticed that, you know, the funding, some of the major funding from my group comes from the US. I can't get the same funding in Australia. Why is that? You know, it just doesn't make any sense. Why should the US be funding us? Well, they fund us because, you know, we're internationally competitive, but you know, getting that funding within Australia, I'm not, you know, I mean, there's reasons that we can go into, but so, you know, lobbying for a better slice of the pie and a bigger pie, you know, I think that's really important for the patient groups. And I think, you know, it gives you the opportunity to think about supporting students and early career researchers. You know, I think those of us that have been in a while, I mean, we should be able to stand on our own 2 feet, but it's really helping the young researchers to make that transition and stay in the field.
The beauty of the endo community, there's not many, but the beauty of it, one of the beauties is when you do exactly what you just said, when we come together in a really organized way and we back something. And when we were involved in the National Action Plan and writing that, it was amazing. The clinicians, the researchers, the patients, the consumers, and those affected all were here for the right reasons. We all knew and still know that things need to be done. And we work together to develop that National Action Plan. So we can see, and we've seen the impact of that. And now we need the community to step up again and say, okay, now we need to go for round 2. Let's do this together. And you can directly see those impacts. If we can raise money through small donations to fund someone's early career, you know, fellowship for a couple of years, that is really not a lot of money, but it's going to make huge impacts going forward. So if you do provide donations or advocacy or sharing with local members of parliament or get involved with us, you can directly see those impacts. And it's not easy, but that's how we keep going, and that's how we get this next generation, like what Sally, we need to keep Sally in this field. We need to continue Grant's mind with Sally past his retirement, so that this work can continue. Otherwise, we will lose it. That is just the matter of fact.
I guess one of the opportunities, Jess, is as we've seen this Medical Research Futures Fund, that a number of the grants that have been given out have been co-funded grants. So somebody's, you know, a group like a patient group with funding to support it, or maybe commercial partners have gone to the MRFF and said, you know, we'll put up some money if you put up a similar amount. And so, you know, I think there are definitely opportunities, direct opportunities with those sorts of things. And And the other thing that I would say is that, taking the long-term view of these things, is really important, because, the progress that I've seen in 20 years is amazing. Like when we started in genetics 20 years ago, people said, why would you ever do that? But yet, as I said, it's really, I think, reshaped global views of the disease and what we need to do to address some of these things. And that time frame is, it's still way too long, I understand, for women who need help now. But I think it is the hope that if we do the fundamental work, that we will understand it, and that will lead to better ways of diagnosis and treatment. And it's not the only research, but it's the kind of work that we believe, will, even if it takes longer, change the fundamental landscape.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for your time. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. There were some interesting questions there, as there always is. But thank you for your dedication, and on behalf of the endo community, thank you for sticking with it. Thank you for sticking with it. It's the generations that come that will really, I know that they will see the impacts of your work in generations to come. Thank you for your time and sharing so diligently and so with such commitment to QENDO, and we're very appreciative. So if anyone would like to back this research and the work that Grant and Sally is doing, please head over to the QENDO website and head to the donate page. If you can even donate $5, $5 times 100 and times 1,000 or 1,000,000 people is a few early career research wages, and that's really what they need. It's so simple. So thank you again, and thanks everyone for coming.